The air in LAX's Terminal 4 was thick with the usual cocktail of anxiety, stale coffee, and the faint citrusy scent of industrial cleaner. It was a symphony of organized chaos, 1,000 different stories converging and diverging with every boarding call. For 17-year-old Dr. Imani Wright, it was just noise, a backdrop to the complex aerodynamic equations dancing in her mind. She was absently tracing the winglet design of a Boeing 787 on her tablet, a design she herself had helped refine when a voice sliced through her concentration, sharp and laced with an authority that grated on her ears. "Can I help you?" Imani looked up. The woman behind the counter was pristine, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, her lips a slash of crimson. Her name tag read Susan, but her eyes said gatekeeper. She wasn't looking at Imani's first-class ticket, clutched loosely in her hand, but at her outfit, a soft grey hoodie from her alma mater MIT, with the hood down a pair of comfortable joggers and worn-out sneakers. It was her standard travel uniform, designed for maximum comfort on long-haul flights. "I'm just waiting for my flight," Imani said, her voice calm, a stark contrast to the sudden unwelcome thumping in her chest. She knew this look. It was a look that stripped away her accomplishments. Her PhD in aerospace engineering earned at 16, her groundbreaking research, her name on patents that were already reshaping the industry, and replaced them with a single damning label. "This is the first-class boarding area," Susan said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Economy boarding is further down the hall." "I know," Imani replied, holding up her ticket more firmly. "I'm in seat 2A. Susan's eyes flickered to the ticket, a brief dismissive glance. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face, quickly replaced by suspicion. "Where did you get this?" The question hung in the air, ugly and accusatory. Imani felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks. It was the same heat she'd felt when a professor had accused her of plagiarism on a paper that was far beyond the scope of the class. The same heat she'd felt when a store owner had followed her through the aisles, assuming she was there to steal. "I bought it," Imani said, her voice tight. "With my own money. I'll need to see some identification." Susan said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She was enjoying this, Imani realized. The power, the public display of authority. A small crowd of onlookers had started to form their faces a mixture of curiosity and mild amusement. Imani sighed, reaching into her backpack for her wallet. She handed over her driver's license. Susan took it, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the counter as she scrutinized it. "Imani Wright," she read aloud, then looked up, her eyes narrowing. "This says you're 17. "That's right," Imani said, her patience wearing thin. 17-year-olds don't typically fly first class. Susan said, a smirk playing on her lips. "Especially not alone." "Well, I'm not your typical 17-year-old, Imani retorted, a hint of steel in her voice. The smirk vanished from Susan's face, replaced by a cold fury. "I think there's been a mistake. This ticket is likely fraudulent. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." "A mistake?" "The only mistake here is your assumption." Imani shot back, her voice rising slightly. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their whispers like the hissing of snakes. "Ma'am, you are causing a disturbance," Susan said, her voice now a sharp weapon. "If you don't step aside, I will have to call security." The threat hung in the air, a promise of humiliation and further escalation. Imani's mind, usually a whirlwind of complex calculations and innovative ideas, was now a vortex of anger and frustration. She had a flight to catch, a keynote address to deliver at the International Aviation Summit in London, a speech that could define her career and inspire a new generation of engineers. And here she was, being treated like a criminal by a woman who couldn't see past her skin color and her comfortable clothes. "Call them," Imani said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Call them right now." Susan's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed into slits. "Fine," she hissed, reaching for the phone. "You brought this on yourself." As Susan's voice crackled over the phone, a new figure emerged from the crowd. A man in an impeccably tailored suit, his face a mask of concern. He was one of the onlookers, and he had seen the whole exchange. He approached the counter, his eyes fixed on Imani. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm and authoritative. Susan, momentarily distracted from her call, looked up at him. "This person is refusing to cooperate. She has a fraudulent ticket and is causing a scene." The man looked at Imani, then back at Susan. "I saw the whole thing. She was perfectly calm until you accused her of fraud. I think you're the one causing the scene." Susan's face turned a shade of purple that clashed horribly with her lipstick. "Sir, this is an airline matter. It doesn't concern you." "It does when your employee is harassing a passenger," the man said, his voice firm. He then turned to Imani, his eyes softening with something that looked like recognition. "You're Dr. Wright, aren't you? I saw your picture in the summit program. I'm a huge admirer of your work on vortex dynamics." Imani stared at him, momentarily stunned into silence. The world seemed to slow down, the cacophony of the airport fading into a dull roar. Here, in the midst of this humiliating ordeal, was a glimmer of hope, a voice of reason. But before she could respond, 2 uniformed security officers arrived, their faces grim, their hands resting on their belts. Susan, seeing her chance to regain control, pointed a trembling finger at Imani. "That's her," she said, her voice triumphant. "She's the one causing all the trouble. I want her removed, now." The officers flanked Imani, their presence a physical manifestation of Susan's prejudice. The man in the suit stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. This is Dr. Imani Wright. She's a guest of honor at the aviation summit." The officers exchanged a skeptical glance. They looked at Imani, at her hoodie and joggers, then back at the man in the suit. They saw a black teenager and a well-dressed white man. The equation in their minds was simple, the conclusion foregone. "Sir, we need you to step back," one of the officers said, his voice firm. "We'll handle this." The man in the suit opened his mouth to protest, but the other officer was already speaking to Imani, his voice cold and impersonal. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." Imani felt a surge of despair. The man's intervention had been a brief, tantalizing glimpse of a different reality. A reality where she was seen for who she was, not what she looked like. But that reality had been snatched away, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving glare of institutional bias. As the officers began to lead her away from the gate, a new voice cut through the tension. It was a voice she knew, a voice that made her blood run cold. "Imani? What's going on?" She turned, her heart sinking. Standing there, his face a mixture of confusion and concern, was her former mentor, Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who had once championed her work, only to later betray her in the most profound way imaginable. A man she had hoped to never see again. And in his hand, he was holding a copy of the summit program. On the cover, in bold letters, it read, "Keynote speaker, Dr. Imani Wright." The picture next to it was a professional headshot Imani in a smart blazer, her eyes bright with intelligence and ambition. It was a picture Susan had clearly never seen. Finch's eyes darted from the program to Imani, then to the security officers. A slow, dawning realization spread across his face, followed by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. He knew exactly who she was, and he knew exactly what was about to happen. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The man in the suit, the gate agent, the security officers, the onlookers, they were all about to witness the collision of two worlds, the implosion of a carefully constructed lie. The calmer Imani thought with a sudden, chilling clarity was about to be brutal. And it was all going to happen right here in the middle of LAX's Terminal 4, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the fluorescent lights. The stage was set. The drama was about to unfold. And she, Dr. Imani Wright, was at the very center of it all. The two security officers, a burly man with a salt-and-pepper mustache named Officer Miller, and his younger, leaner partner, Officer Davis, were operating on a well-worn script. They'd seen this play out 100 times, a disgruntled passenger, a stressed gate agent, a situation that needed to be de-escalated and removed from public view. Imani was just another character in this familiar drama. "Ma'am, please, let's go." Miller said, his voice a low rumble, his hand making a slight guiding gesture towards her elbow. It wasn't aggressive, not yet, but it was firm, a clear signal that compliance was the only acceptable option. But Imani was frozen, her gaze locked on Dr. Alistair Finch. His face, usually a canvas of academic arrogance, was now a mess of conflicting emotions. Shock, fear, and something else. Guilt. The sight of him, the man who had tried to steal her research and pass it off as his own, standing there with the evidence of her success in his hands, was a plot twist she could never have anticipated. "Dr. Finch," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the din of the terminal. Finch flinched, as if struck. His eyes darted around from Imani to the security guards, to the growing crowd of passengers whose phones were now discreetly raised, recording the unfolding drama. He looked like a cornered animal. "Imani, what is all this?" he stammered, gesturing vaguely at the officers. He took a half-step forward, then stopped, his eyes falling on Susan. The gate agent, who was watching the scene with a smug sense of vindication. The man in the suit, whose name Imani would later learn, was David Chen, a senior executive at a rival aerospace company, seized the opportunity. "Officers," he said, his voice ringing with renewed confidence. "This is Dr. Alistair Finch from Caltech. He can corroborate Dr. Wright's identity. In fact, I believe he's also a speaker at the summit." Miller and Davis exchanged another look. This was getting more complicated than they liked. The name Caltech carried weight. They paused, their training kicking in. A potential lawsuit was a far greater threat than a disruptive passenger. Sir Miller said, addressing Finch directly. "Do you know this young woman?" Finch looked like he'd rather swallow his own tongue. To admit he knew Imani was to admit he knew her stature, her importance. To deny it would be a lie, easily disproven by the program in his hand. He was trapped. "Yes," he finally choked out, his voice strained. "Yes, I know her. She is Dr. Imani Wright." Susan, the gate agent, scoffed. "Doctor, she's a teenager in a hoodie. He's probably just trying to cover for her." But David Chen was relentless. He stepped forward, again his voice sharp. "She graduated from MIT at 15, with a double major in physics and aeronautical engineering. She completed her PhD at Caltech in under 2 years. Her doctoral thesis on laminar flow control is the reason half the companies at this summit are redesigning their entire fleet." She isn't just a speaker at the summit. She's the keynote speaker. He pointed to the program in Finch's hand. It's right there on the cover. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Phones were now held aloft more brazenly, the red dots of recording lights winking like malevolent fireflies. The story was shifting the villain and the victim, trading places in real time. Officer Miller's face hardened. He turned his gaze from Imani to Susan, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt of dawning horror appeared in his eyes. He and Davis were not just security guards. They were LAPD officers on airport duty. They understood the implications of a false accusation of a lawsuit that could tarnish their careers. Ma'am Miller said to Susan, his voice now devoid of any warmth. What exactly was the issue with the passenger's ticket? Susan sputtered, her face now pale. It seemed fraudulent. She's so young and she was being belligerent. Belligerent. David Chen interjected, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I was here the whole time. You were the one who was belligerent. You accused her of theft and then called security when she rightly defended herself. The accusation hung in the air, damning and irrefutable. Susan's carefully constructed world of authority and control was crumbling around her. Her eyes darted wildly, looking for an escape, an ally. But there was none. Even her colleagues at the adjacent gates were staring at her, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning apprehension. It was Finch's next move, however, that turned the drama into a full-blown catastrophe for the airline. Overcome by a desperate, self-serving need to align himself with the victor, he rushed forward, his face a mask of feigned concern. Imani, my dear, I am so sorry you had to go through this, he said, his voice oozing a synthetic sympathy that made Imani's stomach turn. This is an outrage, an absolute disgrace to treat a mind like yours, a talent like yours, with such disrespect. He turned to the security officers, his voice rising to a theatrical crescendo. This airline, Global Air, should be ashamed of themselves. Their staff is unprofessional, incompetent, and clearly prejudiced. I will be speaking to my contacts on the board about this. This is unacceptable. The irony was so thick, so suffocating, it was almost comical. Finch, the man who had tried to sabotage her career, was now her self-appointed champion, using her humiliation as a weapon against an airline he likely had some petty grievance with. Officer Miller had heard enough. He held up a hand, silencing Finch. His focus was now razor-sharp. He turned to his partner. Davis, take statements. Get the names and numbers of everyone who witnessed the initial exchange. He then turned to Susan, his voice like ice. Ma'am, I need your employee ID and your supervisor's contact information. You will remain here until my supervisor arrives. Susan looked like she was about to faint. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her crimson lipstick looking like a gash on a corpse. She stammered out her employee number, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold her pen to write down the supervisor's name. The supervisor, a harried-looking man named Frank, arrived minutes later, his face already etched with the dread of a man who knows he's walking into a PR nightmare. He was met with the sight of 2 police officers, a crowd of passengers filming, and a distinguished-looking man who was now loudly proclaiming to anyone who would listen that Dr. Hoho, Imani Wright, was the most brilliant mind in aviation since the Wright brothers themselves. Frank's eyes landed on Imani, who was now standing quietly amidst the chaos, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. The anger had subsided, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. This was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever been judged, dismissed, and humiliated because of how they looked. Dr. Wright. Frank said, his voice tentative. He had hardly been briefed on the phone. I am so sorry. This is a terrible misunderstanding. Please let us escort you to our first-class lounge. We can get this all sorted out. Imani looked at him, her eyes as cold and clear as ice. Your employee accused me of being a criminal in front of an entire terminal. She tried to have me arrested. I don't think a glass of champagne in your lounge is going to sort this out. She then turned to Officer Miller. Officer, I would like to press charges. The words landed like a bomb. Frank's face went from pale to ashen. Susan let out a small, strangled cry. Even Finch looked momentarily taken aback. This was more than he had barged for. Press charges, Frank stammered. But it was a misunderstanding. A mistake. Susan, she's a long-time employee. She's a long-time problem. David Chen interjected, pulling out his phone. And I have a video of the entire interaction, as do at least 20 other people. A video of your employee racially profiling and harassing a passenger who happens to be the keynote speaker at the biggest aviation event of the year. An event, I might add, that your airline is a major sponsor of. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The irony was so perfect, so devastating it was almost poetic. Global Air, a sponsor of the summit, had just publicly humiliated the star of the show. Frank looked like he was going to be sick. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words able to encapsulate the magnitude of the disaster that was unfolding. The unraveling was complete. The damage was done. And the consequences, Imani knew, were only just beginning. The flight to London was still hours away, but the turbulence had already started. And it was going to be a very, very bumpy ride for Global Air. The 10-hour flight to London was a masterclass in corporate panic, a surreal bubble of groveling apologies and transparent damage control unfolding at 35,000 feet. Imani was personally escorted to Global Air's most luxurious accommodation, the Sky Suite, a space so opulent it was less an airline seat and more a miniature hotel room. As the door slid shut, cocooning her in a world of polished wood, cream leather, and muted lighting, she finally allowed herself to exhale. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the ordeal at the gate began to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep weariness in its wake. But beneath the exhaustion, a cold, hard resolve was beginning to crystallize. The parade of supplicants began before the plane even reached cruising altitude. First came the lead flight attendant, a woman named Margaret, with kind eyes and a face etched with genuine horror. She offered champagne, caviar, anything Imani could possibly desire, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Wright, I saw part of what happened. I am mortified. That is not who we are. Imani thanked her, sensing the woman's sincerity, a small island of decency in an ocean of corporate CYA. Next was the captain, who emerged from the cockpit to personally apologize. He was a veteran pilot, a man who had the calm, steady demeanor of someone who has weathered countless storms. Dr. Wright, he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. In my 30 years of flying, I've never been so ashamed of my airline. What you were subjected to was a failure on every level. It was unprofessional. It was inexcusable, and it was wrong. The most surreal moment came mid-flight, when a satellite phone was brought to her on a silver platter. On the line was the head of North American operations, a man whose voice was slick with a practiced, desperate sincerity. He offered her a lifetime of free first-class travel anywhere in the world for her and her family. He offered to make a substantial donation to a charity of her choice in her name. Imani listened patiently, swirling a glass of sparkling water. The offers felt hollow transactional. They wanted to buy her silence, to put a price tag on her humiliation. When he was finished, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you for the offer, but I won't be accepting. I'm not sure your airline's culture is something I want to be associated with regardless of the price of the ticket." She ended the call, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. They didn't understand. This was never about free flights. She spent the rest of the flight working. Tucking away the tablet with its complex equations, she opened a fresh document on her laptop. The speech she had meticulously prepared, a brilliant technical deep dive into vortex-induced vibrations, now felt completely inadequate. It was a speech for a different world, a world that existed before the confrontation at the gate. The world she was flying into demanded something else. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by a righteous anger she was now channeling into a new, more powerful purpose. She wasn't just an engineer anymore. She was a witness. She wrote about the sting of being prejudged, the casual cruelty of assumptions. She typed, "They did not see a scientist. They saw a stereotype. They did not see a mind. They saw a threat." She wrote about the systems and cultures that allow such biases to fester, that empower the Susans of the world and silence the Imanis. This was no longer just a technical paper. It was becoming a manifesto. Meanwhile, the digital world had exploded. David Chen, a man who understood the power of a narrative, had not just sent his video to one journalist. He had sent it to a curated list of tech reporters, social justice advocates, and aviation bloggers. The video, grainy and chaotic, was devastatingly clear. It caught Susan's sneer, Imani's quiet dignity, and Finch's craven opportunism. By the time Imani's flight was over, Greenland and Chan gatekeeper Susan was the #1 trend on Twitter. Memes were already circulating Susan's face superimposed on a picture of a troll guarding a bridge with the caption, "You shall not pass into first class." The hashtag, "I stand with Imani," was a rallying cry accompanied by thousands of personal stories of discrimination under the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack. Global Air's bland pre-written statement, which spoke of reaffirming our commitment to a welcoming environment for all our customers, was met with a torrent of digital scorn. Reaffirm. When did you ever affirm it in the first place? One user retorted a comment that garnered over 50,000 likes. The company's stock was in freefall in after-hours trading. The firestorm was no longer containable. Upon landing at a grey, drizzly Heathrow, Imani was met with the physical manifestation of the airline's panic. A woman in a rumpled suit, her face slick with sweat, rushed toward her, introducing herself as Global Air's head of London customer relations. "Dr. Wright, we have a car for you on the tarmac, and we'll personally escort you through a private customs channel." Imani gave her a polite, cool smile. Standing a few feet away was a calm, professional man holding a simple sign that read, "Wright." He was from the summit. "Thank you," Imani told the frantic airline rep, "but I'll be going with the summit's arranged transport. I prefer the normal channels." She walked past the woman, leaving her sputtering, and stepped into the waiting Mercedes. She was done with their gilded cages and empty gestures. The drive into central London was a blur of traffic and rain-streaked landmarks. but the scene that awaited her at the Intercontinental London Park Lane was anything but blurry. The grand lobby, a cavern of marble and chandeliers, was buzzing with the hushed, excited energy of the world's aviation elite. As she entered, a wave of silence rippled through the room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The whispers followed her, like a shadow. She had arrived not as a prodigy, but as a protagonist. Before she had taken 10 steps, a figure detached himself from a cluster of powerful-looking men. He was impeccably dressed in a Tom Ford suit, his silver hair perfect, his smile a dazzling display of expensive dentistry. But his eyes, she noted, were cold and frantic. They were the eyes of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Right. His voice was a smooth, practiced baritone, the sound of 1,000 boardroom speeches. Richard Sterling, I'm the CEO of Global Air. I am so profoundly glad you made it safely. He extended a hand. Imani met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than was comfortable before taking his hand. Her grip was firm, her expression unreadable. Mr. Sterling, she replied, her voice dangerously calm. I must say, your airline provides a truly unforgettable travel experience. The barb delivered with such surgical precision landed with a palpable thud. Sterling's smile tightened at the edges. A few bystanders tried and failed to hide their smirks. This was better than any panel on fuselage materials. Dr. Wright, he began, launching into a well-rehearsed damage control script. On behalf of our entire global family, I want to offer my most humble, most sincere, and most profound apology. What happened at LAX was a grotesque aberration, a complete failure of our values. The employee responsible has been terminated, and I can assure you we are launching a root and branch, independent investigation. Imani let him talk, her silence a more powerful interruption than any words. She watched him not as a victim, but as a scientist observing a specimen under duress. He was all bluster and corporate speak, a man completely out of his depth. Terminating one employee doesn't fix a broken culture, Mr. Sterling, she said when he finally paused for breath. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the lobby's murmur, causing more people to turn and listen. Your company doesn't have a Susan problem. It has a culture problem, a problem of bias that you have allowed to grow. Sterling's jaw clenched. The mask of contrition was slipping, revealing the raw fury of a powerful man losing control. We are committed to fixing it. We will spare no expense. You know, Mr. Sterling. Imani interrupted her voice, dropping to a near whisper, forcing him and the eavesdroppers nearby to lean in. The saddest part of all this isn't what happened to me. It's that this happens every single day. The only difference is that it happened to your keynote speaker on the eve of a summit you're sponsoring in front of 100 people with smartphones. She let the truth of it hang in the air. The only difference is that this time you got caught. Sterling's face went white. This was no longer a PR crisis he could manage with a statement and a settlement. This was a reckoning. As if summoned by the sheer dramatic tension, a woman from the summit's organizing committee scurried over, beaming blissfully unaware of the war being waged in hushed tones. Dr. Wright. Thank goodness we were so concerned. We have your suite ready. Oh, and we've scheduled a press conference for you at 3 o'clock. The international media is absolutely desperate to speak with you. Imani looked from the organizer's cheerful face to Sterling's. The CEO's expression had collapsed from panicked to positively funereal. A press conference, live, unfiltered. His carefully managed crisis was about to go nuclear. A slow smile touched Imani's lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of grim, resolute purpose. She looked directly into Richard Sterling's terrified eyes. "I'd be delighted to speak with the press," she said. "I have a great deal to say." The ballroom designated for the press conference was a maelstrom of light and sound. It felt like every news organization on the planet had sent a correspondent. The relentless flash of cameras strobed against the dark wood paneling, and the air, thick with anticipation, crackled with the multilingual chatter of journalists jostling for position. At the back of the room, standing behind a velvet rope like common spectators, was Richard Sterling and a handful of his most senior executives. Their faces were grim, their expensive suits looking less like armor and more like funeral attire. They had been forced to attend by the summit organizers, a public act of penance, and were now captive witnesses to their own corporate immolation. When Imani walked onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. She was wearing a simple, elegant, dark blue dress, a stark contrast to the hoodie she had become famous in. She exuded a calm-centered authority that belied her years. She didn't approach the podium like a victim seeking sympathy. She approached it like a scientist presenting her findings. The first questions were a chaotic volley. "Dr. Wright, what is your reaction to Global Air's apology? Will you be filing a lawsuit? How did it feel to be publicly humiliated by the very airline sponsoring this event?" Imani held up a hand, and the room fell silent once more. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the room without the need to shout. "I will not be taking questions at this time, but I will make a statement. Because this story is bigger than me, it is bigger than one airline, and it is bigger than one unfortunate incident." She began not with anger, but with a story. "When I was 9 years old," she said, "I built my first wind tunnel in my garage out of a cardboard box and a window fan. I wanted to understand why things fly. I was fascinated by the forces you couldn't see, lift, drag, thrust. I learned that for anything to get off the ground, it must overcome the forces that are trying to hold it down." The room was spellbound. This was not the fiery denunciation they had expected. The events at LAX were about invisible forces. She continued, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the journalists. The invisible forces of bias, of prejudice, of snap judgments that strip away our accomplishments and our individuality, leaving only a label. The force of an assumption is a powerful form of drag. It is designed to keep people on the ground. For too long, too many people have been held down by this force. Then she turned her attention to the issue at hand. She recounted the events at the gate, not with emotion, but with a chilling factual precision. She laid out the timeline, the words spoken, the actions taken. It was a damning indictment made all the more powerful by its lack of vitriol. "Global Air has offered me compensation," she announced. "Lifetime flights, a sizable donation to a charity of my choice. I am sure their intentions are good. They want to fix this. But you cannot fix a broken culture with a golden ticket." She paused, letting the statement land. "Therefore, I am declining all offers of personal compensation. Instead, today, I am proud to announce the formation of a new foundation, the Fly with Dignity Initiative." A murmur went through the room. This was an unexpected twist. "The mission of this foundation will be simple: to combat systemic discrimination and bias in the travel industry through education, advocacy, and direct legal support for victims. To ensure that the friendly skies are friendly for everyone, regardless of their race, their religion, or the price of their ticket. I will be providing the initial seed funding myself." She then looked toward the back of the room, her eyes finding Richard Sterling. The cameras swiveled in unison, catching his shocked expression in their glare. "And," Imani concluded, her voice ringing with undeniable power, "I am publicly inviting Global Air as a gesture of their stated commitment to change to match my contribution and become our first founding partner." It was a masterstroke of strategic genius. She had rejected their attempt to silence her, and instead had built a platform on the ashes of their failure. She hadn't just taken the moral high ground. She had bought the real estate and was now inviting them to pay rent. Sterling was caught in a checkmate of his own making. To refuse would be a cataclysm confirming every accusation of insincerity. To accept was to publicly fund his own watchdog. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. Before the press conference had even ended, financial news alerts were flashing across phones in the room. Global Air GLA stock plunges another 20% in after-hours trading following Wright press conference. The board of directors, a notoriously unsentimental collection of hedge fund managers and private equity vultures, convened an emergency session. The blood was in the water. But the most devastating karma, the kind that feels like a targeted strike from the heavens, was reserved for Susan. While the corporate giants battled in the media, the digital sleuths of the internet, armed with nothing more than search engines and a thirst for justice, had been digging into the life of #gatekeeper Susan. They weren't just looking for dirt, they were trying to understand the why. And what they found transformed the narrative from a simple story of a racist gate agent into a Greek tragedy of staggering proportions. A student journalist at the USC Annenberg School for Communication, working on a class project, made the final crucial connection. She discovered that Susan was in dire financial straits, a fact corroborated by public records of a pending foreclosure. She found the divorce filings, detailing how Susan's husband had emptied their savings. And then she found the scholarship database. A bright young aerospace engineering student at USC named Ashley. Susan's daughter was a recipient of the prestigious Dr. Alistair Finch STEM Excellence Grant. Curious about the grant's benefactor, the student journalist dug deeper, tracing its funding to a blind trust established several years prior, and the original donor of that trust, Dr. Imani Wright. The story, published on the university's news site, went viral within minutes. The irony was so exquisite, so cruelly perfect, it seemed scripted. The woman whose future Susan had tried to capsize was the same woman who was keeping her daughter's dreams afloat. The bigot was being saved by the benevolence of her victim. This news broke on the final day of the summit, just hours before Imani's keynote address. The story was now a global obsession, a deeply human drama of pride, prejudice, and cosmic justice. That evening, the grand auditorium was filled to capacity, a palpable electricity in the air. When Imani walked on stage, the entire room rose to its feet in a wave of thunderous applause that went on for several minutes. In the front row, Richard Sterling, looking gaunt and 10 years older, sat grimly awaiting his final public flogging. A few rows back, Dr. Finch was a crumpled, invisible man. And somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a young woman, Ashley, sat with tears streaming down her face, her world utterly upended. Imani, standing at the podium, looked out at the sea of faces. She didn't begin with aerodynamics. She began with her own story. "I have always believed that the sky belongs to everyone," she said. "But I have also learned that not everyone is given the same chance to reach it." She spoke of being a young black girl who loved math more than dolls, who was told her dreams were unrealistic. She spoke of the teachers who dismissed her, of the advisors who tried to steer her toward more suitable careers. But for every person who tried to close a door, she said, her voice resonating with emotion, There was someone who opened a window, a mentor who saw potential, a teacher who stayed late to help with a difficult problem, an anonymous donor who funded a scholarship, who invested in a future they would never see. Her eyes flickered for just a second, seeming to find Ashley in the crowd. We all stand on the shoulders of people who believed in us, often without us even knowing their names. Then she turned her focus to the future, to the room full of executives and engineers who designed that future. Progress, she declared, her voice rising each word. A hammer blow is not just about building faster planes or more efficient engines. It is about building a more just world. It is about creating an industry where the only thing that matters is the quality of your ideas, the strength of your character, and the content of your heart. An industry where any child from any background can look up at a plane streaking across the sky and know with every fiber of their being that they belong up there too. She paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the vast hall. To Global Air, and to every other company represented here tonight, I say this. You have a choice. You can continue to be gatekeepers, reinforcing the biases of the past, or you can become gateways lifting people up and opening the skies to all. The choice is yours. She stepped back from the podium. The silence was absolute, a collective, held breath. And then the room erupted. It was not just applause. It was a roar of approval, a standing ovation that felt like a seismic shift, the sound of an entire industry being forced to reckon with its own soul. The karma hadn't just been a slap on the wrist. It was a sonic boom, and its shock waves would reshape the very landscape of the sky. The aftershocks of Imani's keynote address were immediate and seismic. The standing ovation that followed her final words was not merely polite applause. It was a roar, a catharsis, a collective acknowledgement that a fundamental truth had been spoken to power. In the front row, Richard Sterling remained seated, a stone statue, amidst a sea of rising figures, the applause crashing against him like waves against a doomed cliff. A few rows behind him, Alistair Finch had shrunk into his seat, his face ashen, looking like a man who had just witnessed his own obituary being read. The world he knew, one built on posturing and pilfered glory, had been publicly dismantled. Within hours, the Fly with Dignity initiative was more than just an idea. It was a phenomenon. A website hastily erected by a team of volunteer web developers who had been moved by the story crashed from the sheer volume of traffic. Donations poured in from every corner of the globe, from pilots and flight attendants, from frequent flyers and vacationing families, from people who had never set foot on a plane, but who understood the sting of prejudice. The first major corporate donation came not from Global Air, but from David Chen's company. He had called an emergency meeting of his board from his hotel room in London, and their pledge, a 7-figure sum, was announced before sunrise in New York, a strategic and public declaration of where they stood. Trapped and outmaneuvered, Global Air's board convened a brutal hours-long video conference. Faced with a shareholder revolt and the looming threat of mass boycotts, they capitulated. Richard Sterling was forced to make a televised statement, his usual smooth charisma gone replaced by the haggard look of a defeated man. He announced that Global Air would not only match Imani's initial contribution, but would pledge an 8-figure sum over 5 years. He also announced his own immediate resignation. His downfall was swift, merciless, and broadcast globally, a fitting karma for a man who had presided over a culture of dismissiveness. His replacement, a woman lauded for her work in corporate ethics, began her tenure by flying to meet Imani, not as a CEO meeting a victim, but as a student seeking a teacher. Dr. Alistair Finch's academic execution was quieter, but no less final. The whispers of his past plagiarism, once confined to hushed conversations in faculty lounges, erupted into a full-blown scandal. Caltech, its reputation on the line, could not ignore the public outcry. The investigation was swift. Former students came forward emboldened by Imani's courage with stories of Finch taking undue credit, of dismissing the contributions of female and minority students. Confronted by the dean with a mountain of evidence, Finch didn't even try to fight. He signed his resignation letter in silence, clearing out his office in the dead of night, leaving behind nothing but a ghost and a cautionary tale about the perils of intellectual vanity. For Susan, however, the karma was a far more intimate and agonizing affair. Fired, disgraced, and now infamous, she was adrift. Her face was a meme for bigotry, her name a punchline. She lost her apartment, her car, and the few friends who hadn't already been alienated by her bitterness. She ended up in a women's shelter in Van Nuys, a world away from the pristine, orderly life she had once known. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on her day and night. The true breaking point came during a stilted, painful phone call with her daughter Ashley. It was Ashley who told her about the scholarship. She had seen the news online, the intricate, devastating connection laid bare for the world to see. "The woman you called the criminal mum." Ashley's voice had trembled with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "She's the reason I can even go to college. She's the reason I have a future. How could you?" The question was a knife to Susan's heart, a wound far deeper than any public shaming. The woman she had tried to destroy was her daughter's anonymous savior. The hypocrisy of her life, the sheer, staggering blindness of her prejudice, crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. It was in that rock-bottom moment, sitting on a lumpy cot in a room that smelled of disinfectant and despair, that the letter arrived. It had been forwarded from her old address, a simple cream envelope with her name written in elegant, flowing script. She opened it with trembling hands. The letter was short, but every word carried the weight of a profound, life-altering choice. Imani wrote not of anger or accusation, but of a shared humanity. She spoke of mistakes and the possibility of growth. She spoke of Ashley's promise and a mother's importance. "I believe in second chances," the final line read. "I hope you do too." Enclosed was a simple business card for the Fly with Dignity Foundation, with a handwritten number on the back for a contact in their new outreach and assistance program. For 3 days, Susan did nothing. The letter sat on her bedside table, both a condemnation and a lifeline. Could she accept help from the very person she had wronged so terribly? The shame was a powerful poison, but the thought of her daughter, of the broken bridge between them, was a more powerful antidote. With a humility she had never known, she made the call. The journey back was not easy. The foundation connected her with a counselor, a patient woman who helped her unpack the years of resentment and fear that had calcified into prejudice. She entered a job training program, not for the airline industry, but for social work. She found that her experiences, once a source of deep shame, could be a source of profound empathy. She learned to listen. She learned to see the people around her not as categories, but as individuals with their own stories. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to rebuild the bridge with her daughter. It started with tearful apologies, with a raw, unflinching admission of her own failings. It continued with small acts of support, with attending Ashley's study groups, with learning for the first time about the complex beauty of aerospace engineering, the field that connected her daughter to the woman who had shown her such extraordinary grace. Months bled into a year. One day Susan stood before a small group in a community center classroom. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked out at the faces before her, new hires for a local bus service, a diverse group of men and women about to enter the front lines of customer service. The workshop Dignity in Transit was funded by a small grant from the foundation Imani had built. "My name is Susan," she began, her voice clear and steady, "and I want to tell you a story about the worst mistake of my life." She told them everything. The pride, the prejudice, the power trip, the humiliation she had caused, and the deeper humiliation she had endured. And then she told them about the letter, about the second chance she never deserved, but had been given anyway. She used her own story, not as an excuse, but as a lesson, a powerful, painful, and ultimately hopeful lesson in the transformative power of empathy. Imani, now at the helm of a global movement and still a pioneering force in aerospace, never saw Susan in person again. She didn't need to. She read the reports from the foundation, saw the quiet, impactful work being done in forgotten community centers, and she knew that the ripples of that day at LAX were no longer just waves of anger but currents of change. The karma had been delivered not just as a swift, brutal punishment, but as a slow, patient, and ultimately redemptive balancing of the scales. A CEO had fallen, a fraud had been exposed, but a woman had been reborn, and a new standard had been set, a reminder that the journey to the sky must begin with dignity on the ground. Here is the conclusion for your video. This story is a powerful reminder that one person's voice can create a tidal wave of change. It's about more than just an incident at an airport. It's about the fight for dignity, respect, and the incredible power of grace in the face of prejudice. If Imani's journey moved you, if you believe in the fight for a more just and equitable world, then please help us spread this message. Like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's continue to demand better. Let's be the change we want to see in the world. Thank you for watching.